Well, since we took the 2 weeks off, I think this is session number 6, I believe, for this this evening, but I'm not really sure. And I did not take the time to look, so we're just gonna go with it. I'm gonna declare this as session number 6. And tonight, we are going to look at Deuteronomy 12, verses 1 through 12. But before we do that, I'd like to do a little bit of review of where we've been. So keep in mind, the basic question we're going for is, how do Christians respond to, think about, interact with, yield to, obey the biblical law, so the Old Testament law? So that's the question we've been working on, and we're continuing to work on it using parts of the book of Deuteronomy to help us there. Where have we been? We talked about the function of the law, and the law here refers to the Old Testament law, according to these 3 main church leaders from the past. So Luther's view is that the law has a twofold function: to convince us of sin and to prepare us for the gospel. And then Calvin essentially has the same 2 and then a third. So to curb injustice, to prepare sinners to receive the gospel, to teach Christians the way of God in living faithfully. And then Wesley, to reflect God's character and purpose. And here we get into how, a little bit more specifically, in the New Covenant, God reinscribes the moral law on our hearts. So that makes it possible for us to obey the law, the moral law. And he has this really fascinating concept of the law in the Old Testament is a command. In the New Testament, it's a promise because of Christ. Now, this, in a way, dodges a little bit the question we're working with here, because we have the law of Moses, right? We have all these laws, and food laws, and sacrifice laws, and things like that. We don't observe those laws. We just don't observe those laws. But what does that mean for Christians then? Does it mean that they're not relevant, that we don't bother reading them, or something like that? Well, we know that that's not really what it means, but then what does it mean? What do we do? What should be our response? And so we're just kind of practicing with thinking about that question. And so we're going to use Deuteronomy 12, 1 through 12 as the kind of a case study for tonight. We'll do maybe 3 or 4 of these, and then we'll wrap it up. So just a little bit of, again, kind of setting the framework here. It's important when we look at the law, it's important to remember certain basic truths that the Old Testament teaches. And the first one is God gives the land, right? It's a commandment for them to take the land, but all through the Old Testament, it says repeatedly that God, Yahweh, gives these people that land. A couple of examples from the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 8:1-8. See, I have set the land before you. Go in and take possession of the land that I swore to your ancestors to give them and to their descendants after them. This is a long-term promise going back to Abraham in chapter 12 of Genesis. And then Deuteronomy 7:1, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are about to enter, and he clears away many nations before you. So this is God's doing, right? Everything, we're framing everything we're thinking about regarding the law as, God is making the prior action, and we should really keep that in mind. Okay. God gives the land. Secondly, now I'm quoting from this Deanna Thompson from a commentary on Deuteronomy. Recall that in the first 11 chapters of Deuteronomy, which, you know, we're not reading those chapters, but recall that in the first 11 chapters, we are reminded repeatedly that the statutes and ordinances set forth in chapters 12 through 26. So that's the section of the law where we're going to kind of do some core samples, you might say, are God's gracious gift given for the sake of the life and well-being of Israel. So we need to keep in mind that the law given by God for the purpose of helping Israel live well, to live the good life, that they can live long and prosper, that they can dwell in this land and prosper in it if they'll follow the terms of the covenant. So let's look at some examples of where this idea comes across that Deanna Thompson is naming here. Deuteronomy 4, verse 1. Deuteronomy 4:1, and I'm reading always from the New Revised Standard. So if you have a different reading that you would like to share, please mention it. Deuteronomy 4:1. So now, Israel, give heed to the statutes and ordinances that I am teaching you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. You must neither add anything to what I command you, nor take away anything from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God with which I'm charging you. Okay? He's giving us the land. Verse 14. And the Lord charged me at that time, Moses says, to teach you statutes and ordinances. See that repetition. Statutes and ordinances for you to observe in the land that you are about to occupy. Chapter 6, verse 1. Statutes and ordinances that God is giving. Verse 2, so that you and your children and your children's children may fear the Lord all the days of your life and keep all his decrees and commandments that I'm commanding you, so that your days may be long. 7:11. Yeah, 7:11. Therefore, observe diligently the commandments, the statutes, and the ordinances, and so on. And then Deuteronomy 5:33 and 6:24. This is where we get into the well-being, you might say. 5:33. 5:33.
Steve, even the one that you just read, the next verse.
Yeah, exactly.
Promise of well-being.
Right. You must follow exactly the path that the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live, and that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land that you are to possess. So I think it's really important for us as Christians to keep in mind that the law is meant for the people's good. It's meant for the people's good. That's very important. 6:24. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our lasting good, so as to keep us alive, as is now the case. So just for starters, as we think about the law, I think it's good to remember the purpose of the law is for the good of the people. Now, I want to take a minute to compare, because we're going to look at chapter 12 in a second, where it says, tear down the idols, smash the pillars and the altars, and just destroy everything pagan in the land. So let's think for a second about what is the religion? And of course, there are variations, but what basically is the religion of the people in the land where Israel is going in? Now, if you've read enough of the Old Testament, this is the big problem. The Israelites are constantly led away by the deities of these other nations surrounding them. So let's think for a little bit. Now let's go to chapter 12 and look at verse 5. Let's see, is that right? Was that one? Then again, I'm sorry, it's verse 3. It's chapter 12, verse 3. Something I knew wasn't right. My version says, break down their altars, smash their pillars, burn their sacred poles. What does yours say?
Burn their Asherim with fire.
Asherim. Okay, so that's the plural of Asherah. All right. So Asherah. What is an Asherah? Well, an Asherah is a sacred pole. Well, what else is it? So we're going to look at that in a second. But let's just look here at some of the characteristics just from these verses. What do you notice, for example, at verse 2? Where is the Canaanite religion practiced?
Mountain Heights.
Okay,
On
where else?
On
Hills.
the heights and the hills and under every green tree.
Yeah. Okay. And, the scholars who work on this, the archaeologists, they have found, examples of places of worship for this Canaanite religion, and like tree groves, these rows of trees planted, and so altars, shrines, tree groves. But yeah, so the places, plural, of where the Canaanites worship. That means all through the land. All through the land that the Israelites are going to settle. The Greek version of Asherim is Astarte. So if you see that sometimes, it's the same deity. Now, here is a figurine of the goddess Asherah, who is paired with the god Baal or Baal, right? We hear a lot about Baal worship in the Old Testament. So Baal and Asherah are sort of the two main deities for the various Canaanite groups. There's a picture of her from the World History Encyclopedia. This is a fertility religion. And the scholars, there used to be more kind of, scholars generally thought that, fertility religion involved temple prostitutes and things like that. And they're now kind of qualifying that, maybe not temple prostitutes, but probably in an annual festival of some kind, there were sexual acts involved, because those sexual acts sort of mirror what they want the gods to do with making sure the cows have calves, and the ewes have lambs and the crops grow and all that. So what did they do in this religion? Well, that's one of the things they did. Whoops. I didn't mean to go backwards. So you can imagine up on the high places, in the groves of trees, the burning of incense, the pouring out of libations, and then some kind of sexual activity, maybe not as often as scholars used to think, but still, when you compare that to what God is teaching the Israelites about, how to live, this is by comparison, it would be, I'll just say this, vastly different, right? Vastly different from what God is saying. And so I think that's partly, this is very important that we realize this distinctiveness of Israel comes from the commandments, the statutes, and the ordinances that God is giving them. And just to kind of jump out there a little bit, so even things like, you can eat this kind of food, don't eat that kind of food. I think just if we can't always explain why this food is okay, that food is not okay, what it does help us understand is that God is just setting up some boundaries that his holy people are supposed to follow to show that they belong to Yahweh and not these other deities. So if there's no other reason, I mean, God is God and he can say the way he wants it. There's kind of that, there's a little bit of that notion in this picture. Okay, look at verse 4 in chapter 12. You shall not worship the Lord your God in these ways. Right? Not on every high place, not in the tree groves, not doing the things that the king, you're not going to worship that way. So here's where we remember, we're now going to be dealing with the question of worship with the first two of the 10 commandments. And that's Deuteronomy 5, 7 through 9. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I am the Lord your God. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, etc. And then look at 6:13. The Lord your God you shall fear, him you shall serve, and by his name alone you shall swear. So this is, this is narrow and exclusive, Yahweh alone. And we're not going to worship in any way the way the Canaanites do, except for they had sacrifices. Israel will have sacrifices, but for entirely different reasons. Okay, back to Deuteronomy 12. And stop, interrupt me at any time if you have a question or a comment. Deuteronomy 12, verse 5. But you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes as his habitation, to put his name there. Now notice, if you look at verses 5, 6, and 7. In my version, it's the word there. You shall go there, right? There's one place. One God, one place. You shall go there, bringing there your burnt offerings, and you shall eat there. It's very specific. But where is there?
It's a place he will choose.
Right. And where is that?
The tabernacle?
Yeah, I mean, that's what,
Jerusalem.
yeah, that's, but to my knowledge, there is no specific instruction that God says, okay, here, build the temple here, right? I don't think that's in the Old Testament anywhere in any of these stories. So it's very, and this will become clearer later because I'm sort of setting up a point for later. It's very clear that God says, you go to the place that I tell you, but then it doesn't really say exactly where that place is. We associate it with Jerusalem and the temple, and we're going to get into that, but it doesn't really say, yeah, what?
Well, or the tabernacle here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't really say, God doesn't ever say, so far as I know in the Old Testament, go, okay, here's where I want you to build the house, right? And I think there's some significance to that.
I have a note, and
Yeah.
this came from some other studies, and I don't know the context of the note, but it's my writing. It says, go to the place where the name will be placed.
Yes.
The name.
Right. Right. God's name. Yeah. Yahweh. Hashem, that name. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. He's very specific about it. You go to the place where I'll tell you, where my name will be, but then where is that place?
So you're thinking that when he gives Moses the clear instructions for the tabernacle, that is not the place where he says, build that I will dwell? That is
The
the place.
tabernacle is mobile.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, I
So,
know it's mobile, but
yeah,
that is still the place.
it is the
Yeah.
place, but the place moves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, it goes with it,
Right,
which is,
right.
yeah.
And that, again, it's not like the Canaanite religion, because you build a shrine and then the god somehow mysteriously inhabits that shrine. Well, we could say the same about the temple, but again, there's ambivalence in the Old Testament. And we'll see this, I'll show you this when we get to it in a little bit, but it's God's instruction to the people does not parallel the Canaanite understanding of place and shrine and divine presence in that place, all that.
Pastor Steve,
Yeah,
maybe get things all mixed up, but I was thinking God told Solomon almost very exacting details on how to build.
we're gonna look at that.
But so therefore, I have always assumed
Yeah.
he told them where
Place.
to build.
Right.
Given that so many cubics this way and that way, the wall so
Yep,
thick.
yep, that's right. We do get those instructions, but again, I'm sort of letting the cat out of the bag here, but the actual instructions from God is to Moses for the tabernacle. When we get to what Solomon builds in Jerusalem as the temple, it actually says Solomon did this. Now we get dimensions.
All kinds of details.
We get details, right, but it isn't, we'll get there,
Okay,
but that's, that's. Very good,
So, just thinking. The place where they covenanted first with God. Is Peter. Where is Sinai coming? In the mountain of God, where the law was given. That's never addressed again. Is it as being the holy mountain of God?
it's referred to, but it's not like that's where the shrine is and, they go on pilgrimage back to Sinai. Elijah goes there,
Does it have other
First
names? Sinai have other names?
Mount Seir,
No.
Seir, but Horeb,
Or there.
yeah. Yeah,
So you do see it kind of show up if you know it's.
right, but it's
got
not,
a new name.
But it's not revered as a place of covenant.
No, yeah.
no,
They have the tablets then that go into.
yeah, right, right, yeah. Yeah, okay, it's good thinking, that's. What does all this mean? So, location, let's go to 1 Samuel 1:3. After the people enter the land. There's no more talk of tabernacle the way we think of it in the wilderness when they're on the move. For Samuel 1:3. Now, this man
Elkanah.
used to go up, this is Samuel's father. Hannah's husband. Now this man used to go up year by year from his town to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh. Now, if you look at a map of the Bible lands, you go north of Jerusalem a bit and you see Bethel. And you go a little bit further north of Bethel and you get Shiloh. Now, I haven't dug into this. How did Shiloh become a central shrine place? I mean, when you think about Israel as the 12 tribes settled and where they are, it's sort of in the middle of the 12 tribes. That makes sense. And there is some sort of building there. I hesitate to use the word temple, because it's not like the Jerusalem temple, but there is a building there.
It's not the tabernacle?
It's not the tabernacle. No, it's not the tabernacle that was constructed in the wilderness and then set up. No.
Oh,
But is that
it
where,
was.
I mean, eventually that becomes Samaria? Isn't that?
I think so. Yeah, I think
Is
so. I
that-
don't remember exactly where the boundary line is.
He talks about going there because the two sons of Eli were there, and they were priests. So it must have been, was that where the tribe of Levi was located?
That's a good question, but so they're scattered all through the land, right?
Oh, that's right. They didn't have a place, did they?
Right.
Right. Because
Okay.
they're, to say it this way, they are available to people for various kinds of sacrifices. So Shiloh, yeah,
So how many generations were there from this point to Solomon? That must be 5 generations, isn't it?
from First Samuel, from where we are right now,
Yeah.
it would be 3 generations, right? Saul, David, Solomon. And of course, David is not Saul's son, but basically we have Saul's reign, and then we have David's reign, and then we have Solomon's reign. So I think it's 3 generations from where we are in First Samuel.
Okay.
That's so interesting. I always assumed in the time of David, when they talk about the Ark of the Lord being at so-and-so's house, or, or
Yeah.
in Shiloh,
Right.
I assumed that's where the tabernacle was.
If it is, I've missed something for decades, but I don't think so. I just don't think so, because the tabernacle, when it's set up, would be quite a sizable land area that it's covering, right? Because you have the tent proper, then you have the courtyard, and then you have the big curtains around the courtyard, and I don't think so. I think that the tabernacle, if somebody can show me that I'm wrong about this, I will.
Okay.
First, I'll be embarrassed because it's probably something I should know, and then I will stand corrected. Yeah,
So where was the Ark of the Covenant then?
And the Philistines, they took it.
right. It moved around a little bit because the Philistines captured it and held on to it, and then of course it caused problems for them. So it wound up in a town, and I'm forgetting the guy's name.
Obed-Edom.
Yeah, Obed-Edom,
Yeah.
at his house, so like west of Jerusalem. And it was there for a long time until David brought it to Jerusalem. Right? Yeah. Yeah, Joni?
No, nothing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the place that, this emphasis on the place, the single place. Well, where is that place? Well, Shiloh, for a while, serves as the place. There, Eli is there as the priest, his sons are there. People come to Shiloh like Hannah and Elkanah do to offer sacrifice. So we have that. Now, let's look at 2 Chronicles 3. Verse 1. Second Chronicles gives us this place, names the place as Mount Moriah. where the Lord had appeared to his father David at the place that David had designated. So it doesn't say the Lord designated. So David, this is the threshing floor of Ornan, right? It's in Jerusalem. It's in the city of David, which now, Jerusalem encompasses the city of David. So Mount Moriah. Now it doesn't say this in First Kings. There's some repetition here between First Kings and Second Chronicles, but it doesn't name it as Mount Moriah in First Kings. But where do we hear about Mount Moriah? Anybody
Where the
remember?
temple was built. It's a temple
Sorry?
was built.
Yeah, the temple, presently, but
Mhm.
back in the history of
Right.
Israel.
So
or-
Isaac was going to be sacrificed on Moriah.
Exactly. So Genesis 22. Oh, what's going on with my? Okay, my slides are messed up. What happened there? There should be a Genesis 22 that shows up, but it's not, so. But again, in Genesis 22, it does say that the Lord says to Abraham, go, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the place that I will show you and offer him there as a sacrifice to me. But then later on the journey, Abraham goes to Moriah, but it doesn't really say in Genesis 22, God doesn't say, okay, this is the place. But somehow Abraham seems to know that. But Moriah is mentioned there. So in Second Chronicles is making that connection with Mount Moriah, which I think is significant, right? Because God's son is sacrificed, as it were, on Mount Moriah. Now that may be, not exactly precise, but in the vicinity. And, Christian thinkers over the years have made that sort of connection.
Well, it says that Abraham went with his son Isaac, but set out for the place that God had told him about.
Ah, well, yeah, okay,
So who knows?
right.
Specific,
There was a lot unsaid in Genesis 22.
Exactly, there is a lot unsaid. And I think there's a fair amount unsaid here in Deuteronomy that we're looking at.
Yeah.
Because that go there to the place that I was go, there you will do it, there you will do it, there you will do it. Well, where is there? Well, it's the tabernacle. But eventually the tabernacle, when you trace the history of the tabernacle apparently goes away, and it's Shiloh. And how did we get to Shiloh? And then we're going to wind up in Jerusalem, and we know how we got there, but it doesn't really say God told the people, this is the place where I want you to build my house. And all of that kind of vagueness, that gap is, I think, important, and we will get there. Okay. Now, Second Chronicles 6. First two verses. And you notice what I say here, ambivalence about the place where God dwells, because right there in those two verses, then Solomon said, the Lord has said that he would reside in thick darkness. Well, if you've ever been to someplace like Carlsbad Caverns, you know what, I don't know if it's 100% darkness, but it is dark. I don't know if that's thick darkness, but I mean, the thick darkness suggests the hiddenness of God. Even though God is present, he's still in some way hidden. But then verse 2, I have built you an exalted house, a place for you to reside in forever. So this is Solomon saying to the Lord, but Solomon has just admitted the Lord has said he would reside in thick darkness. Now look at verse 25. This is Solomon's dedicatory prayer of the temple. And notice, may you hear from heaven. Now, heaven is not far away someplace, but heaven is a different dimension. So even though we have a place now, we've got the temple, we've got the Holy of Holies, we've got the Ark of the Covenant inside the Holy of Holies. We've got a place, but still that place does not contain Yahweh. And the Bible's very clear about this. So even with all these physical locations involved, very clear, Yahweh is not limited to that place. There's nothing about this place that binds Yahweh. Okay, verse 20.
So
I skipped 21, sorry. When they pray toward this place, may you hear from heaven, your dwelling place. Hear and forgive. And then 27. These are just, you can find several of these in this long prayer. Verse 27. May you hear in heaven, forgive the sin of your servants, your people Israel, and so on. So some ambivalence.
That chapter, I'm sorry, verse 18, in that same chapter. Solomon is saying, God really dwell on earth? like
Yeah.
that?
Right. Yeah,
The heavens cannot contain you.
right.
Much less.
I'm glad you pointed that out because I meant to have that one on the list here and I just skipped it. Yeah. That question, will God indeed reside with mortals on earth? Even heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this place, this house that I have built? Yes,
The 23rd Psalm, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever,
Right.
because in favor itself.
right. Right. So this ambivalence, I think, is really purposeful. The scriptures purposefully leave this kind of a, it's very clear that the Lord is present with them. But that the place itself is not necessarily of supreme importance. Because what happens when when later on during the days of Jesus, that place, the temple it's become almost like an idol, right? And that in one sense, it's why Jesus says it's going to get torn down.
and it's a den of vipers.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Not going to look at this, of course, but very explicit instructions in Exodus 25 through 27 for the tabernacle. Now, we say explicit, there are a lot of details there, but if you're an architect trying to figure out exactly how, there's still lots of unanswered questions, but that's way beyond my capacity. So now let's go to 1 Kings 6 and see the difference. Again, in Exodus 25 through 27, Yahweh, the Lord, is giving Moses the instructions for the construction of the tabernacle. In 1 Kings 6, starting at the beginning. Look at verse 2. The house that King Solomon built for the Lord was, and all through chapter 6, we get a fairly detailed description, all those cubits and the dimensions. But it's a description. It's not a set of instructions from the Lord the way the tabernacle instructions were given. So the Bible isn't really claiming that the temple in Jerusalem is God's design, God's plan, God's instruction. Even though the book of Deuteronomy says, you're gonna worship at the place where I tell you. You go there to worship me, not not all the.
When you think of David saying, I'm gonna build you a house, and God's saying, no, I'm gonna build you a house.
Right.
But he does say, your son will build me a house.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But back on the Canaanite religion for a second, imagine the Israelites saying, okay, everywhere the Canaanites had a shrine, we're gonna go and build our shrine there, and it'll be like kind of competing, right? It'll be, we'll show them. That's exactly what God is saying, don't do that, right? Because you do that, you're playing their game, right?
But they did.
Yeah, exactly, they did that, right? And that is anticipated in Solomon's prayer. Yeah, they tried to play the game and lost. Okay, 6:2, as I pointed out, the house that Solomon built for the Lord. 6:13 and 14. This is just a question I have as I read this. Go back to 12. Concerning this house that you are building. This is the word of the Lord to Solomon. Concerning this house that you are building, if you will walk in my statutes, obey my ordinances, keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will establish my promise with you, which I made to your father David. With your father David. No, 2, sorry. I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. So Solomon built the house and furnished it. So there again, the ambivalence. Okay, build the house, but you know, it's the relationship. It's do what I say. If you'll do what I say, I'm with you. The house, it's important, but it's not supremely important. Now we're getting down to what I find especially intriguing. In the New Testament, what happens to the temple?
Well, not in the New Testament, but after it's destroyed.
Okay, so the physical edifice is destroyed, but how is the temple referred to in the New Testament? Let's look at 1 Corinthians 3. 16 and 17. And the you here in verse 16 is second person plural you. Now, I think, and I'm interested in what you think about this, but I think if you look at what these Old Testament passages suggest about God's attitude toward the physical temple that gets built. I'm trying to say 2 things, and this is, I haven't figured out a good way to say this, but the 2 things are, there's a sort of a parallel, right, between the temple in the Old Testament and the temple, now the New Testament temple, right? There is a temple. It's not stones, it's people. So there's that distinctiveness that I think may suggest something about the basic way we set ourselves up in relation to the law. And again, I'm just kind of thinking out loud about this. But there's also, the other part of that is there's also this real connection. Like the Christians have a connection to the temple through the way the Old Testament describes it. Because it's used in the New Testament as a picture of God's people. And of course, that carries into the book of Revelation as well, right? With the city, the heavenly city, and the dwelling place of God is among mortals, it says. Okay, so Ephesians 2, 19 and 20. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, These are the Gentiles, right? The Gentile believers in Ephesus. You're no longer strangers and aliens, but you are citizens with the saints and also members of the household of God, built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the cornerstone. In him, the whole structure is joined together and grows into a holy temple of the Lord. I just want to take a second. How does this hit you? You know, what thoughts stir up? I find this kind of intriguing, you know, at some level.
Well, even the verse that we read in Corinthians where it says, what, don't you know that you are God's temple? And it's like, well, no, you know, like,
Yeah.
he says it
Yeah.
like, everybody already knows this.
Right.
And I don't know, I find that kind of interesting. I kind of wonder if the Corinthians looked around at each other and said, what?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
No, we didn't know that.
I don't think the Jewish Christians did.
Yeah, what? Yeah.
Yeah, because when First Corinthians is written, the temple in Jerusalem is still standing. So there is a physical building. But if you go back to some things Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, for example, about if you swear by the temple, it's, you know, it's not valid, but if you swear by the gold of the temple. And I mean, he makes these veiled references to the temple that are, I mean, they're kind of apocalyptic, right? Now, here's what I don't want to suggest. I'm not suggesting that somehow God's people as the temple replace Israel as God's people. I'm not saying that at all. But there is this kind of interesting transference that God's presence is now found among the people who belong to Jesus. And that they are the living stones, right?
And so I was trying to find that.
That's in First Peter, I think. It's either First or Second Peter.
Well, I think it was first Peter.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so now, you know, that
First Peter 2.
okay, yeah. I'm asking us now to think about these scriptures that we've been looking at. I think it kind of set up a perspective, an approach where we see that we are distinct and yet deeply related, like deeply connected. Distinct, we're God's temple, distinct, but deeply related to these Old Testament passages. I think in a kind of parallel way, we're distinct, but deeply connected to the Old Testament law. I don't exactly know the implications of what I'm saying. And I realize that in a way, I've probably already said this in other sessions. But I think when I read this, I'll say I feel a certain kind of freedom not to worry over much, that we don't follow the food laws. At the same time, I also don't think, well, we just skip over those parts, right? And we're going to practice this in the next couple of weeks, reading more specific kind of statutes like that, right? So we're going to get there. So a certain kind of freedom, but still tied to it, right? Tied to it.
It does, even if you don't know what every single one of the laws were for, what was the purpose of all of them, it does speak to the idea that God does have an opinion about what is good and what is not good.
Right,
And it's not so easy to find, is it?
And some, like. And sometimes it's just that.
Don't these laws make us accountable?
We are to be.
just a second, Larry. Yeah,
Only separate.
right,
And
Yeah.
those things. Do that.
yeah, I think that's right. Go ahead, Larry.
Well, I'm just saying, don't these laws just make us accountable?
Right, I think in a way, you and Joanne are making parallel statements. She was talking about, I don't know, could you hear her?
No,
Yeah. She was talking about the laws really do set the people apart, right? And that's, am I following? That's as true of Christians, right? We are to be a set apart people, and being set apart, to follow up with your point, Larry, is we are accountable to God. What sets us apart is we're accountable to this God, right? Not other gods.
Well, and Paul was pretty specific about. What those laws, I mean, the basic laws that you be set apart.
Yeah.
Do not eat food sacrificed to idols, that is, don't do the idol worship thing, don't get it, that's a thing with the people. And avoid sexual immorality.
Right, Yeah.
That's pretty specific.
right, right, yeah,
So you have the food laws. And we have a relationship.
other kinds of other boundary laws, right? Yeah. Yeah,
And of course, the Ten Commandments, I mean, there isn't anybody who would say those are not worth,
right,
those have great value.
Yeah.
In keeping peace and, prospering people.
right,
I don't mean money prospering, I mean just a good life.
yeah, right.
Mhm.
Flourishing,
Flourishing.
Thriving. yeah. Well, yes, ma'am,
One more thing,
sure,
looking at. Start the building, the edifice, temple,
uh-huh,
holy place. First Peter is very clear that. I laying the stone in Zion. Cornerstone,
right,
it's Jesus.
yeah, right,
And then we get to be standing stones.
yeah,
It does also make you think, like if you've seen a building where the stones are crumbling and the whole building is sort of. Like you can't keep a whole building up with big parts of the building crumbling.
Yeah.
So I feel more responsibility to think that I am part of that temple, because I have a role to play and I better be playing it.
Yeah.
According to God's calling on my life,
Right.
because the building needs me.
yeah. Okay, well, so in Deuteronomy 12, we have, you might say, further instruction on the first two commandments about having only the Lord as God and not making any idols. Or to extend that a little bit, worshiping Yahweh in the manner that other nations worship their gods. So this kind of distinctiveness, and that really comes from the law. And as Christians, it seems to me that still holds. Even though we know what we don't do that God commanded the Jews to do, we definitely are held accountable to worshiping only the Lord. The Lord Yahweh is the Father of the Son, Jesus Christ, same God, right? So this is where I'm feeling that it's more than just a historical connection. It's okay, this still applies. All right. How do you deal with idolatry? Well, you smash the altars, right? So what do you think? This is where the question about, this is kind of narrow and exclusive and, well, there's Paul Stallsworth.
Hey, Steve.
Hi there. Sort of narrow and exclusive and not really. Who do they think they are to smash up somebody else's religion? I mean, again, nobody's advocating. I'm not go.
No, go ahead.
Well, I'm just not advocating, okay, let's go, let's go tear down, pick your call, let's go tear down. I'm trying to find one that would not be controversial, all right? Let's go tear down the local Church of Scientology building.
Yeah, here's the problem with that, I think.
Yeah.
That the way we use the word religion would have been completely foreign to the people when the law was given to them.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't, Judaism against Ashtarism, it was like, that is our modern way of seeing religion,
Yeah.
But idols, okay, let's not talk about somebody else's religion. Let's talk about the idols that we have in our society that are treated religiously because people adhere to them with passion, but they're not religions,
Yeah.
they're idols.
Yeah, so let me add a little more detail to your point about the way we think about religion today. So all of us have learned, whether we agree with that learning or not, it's still it's just kind of working in our minds, I think, like background noise. Modern Western peoples tend to think of religion as a human artifact of some kind, like a human construction. And the assumption there is that, that no one religion has it exactly right, and all the religions are trying to get to the same place. There are a lot of assumptions in that way of thinking about religion that makes it seem very improper to want to do anything to harm another religion, this peaceful coexistence and all that. But if we move away from the notion of human construct and that the God we worship, right, has an impact, who the God is whom we worship, and the way that God calls us to worship has an impact on the way people live. So here we go back to the Canaanite religion and the things they did, right? And you can get into some of the other religions, the passing their children through the fire. One theory that I read is that, most likely there were some temple prostitutes. It may not have been as widespread as people used to think, but it's possible that these children that were offered to the god Molech were children of the temple prostitute. Now imagine that. The barbarism. And this isn't, we're not making this up. This is the sort of thing that was actually going on. So when God says, tear down those altars, it still may seem like, we know we shouldn't really go that far, but to stand firmly against idolatry, maybe this is also a lesson Christians can learn from the law. That,
We should be asking ourselves, all of the things that we hold dear. We should be measuring up to what God says about idolatry.
Right.
And,
right.
Yeah.
And that's harder for us to do because,
Yeah.
again, we've sort of put religion in a certain kind of category.
Exactly.
So we don't recognize the word worship as having anything to do with,
Or even idolatry, we don't recognize as having anything to do with the things that we think are precious, that we,
right,
offended if other people don't agree with us and
right,
hold it up as if it's,
right.
yeah.
So I think, you know, the point that I've been working on is here we're reading the law. And we might not do exactly like, you know, literally go smash altars and things like that, but the who God is, the way we are to worship and the boundaries we should vigilantly protect, that we can learn a lot, right? From studying a passage like Deuteronomy 12, we could benefit by finding an appropriate way in our day and time to obey what it is saying. So I think here's an example of how Christian study of the Old Testament law can be very edifying for us. All right, next week, we're going to try these two scriptures. And if you just turn over very quickly and look at if you scan Deuteronomy 14:22 through 29. Okay, and then look at chapter 19. And there's no particular reason I'm picking. My reason is I've just been looking through here to try to get a sense of something that's manageable for our study and also in the ballpark of what we've been trying to work on. So 19, 14 through 21. Something as mundane as property boundaries.
Yeah. You use fair weights and measures.
Yeah.
I mean, all of it makes sense.
Okay. Well, we will see you next week. It's good to be back with you.